If you have been following along with our track record series on the podcast feed, you know I've been going through a bunch of old books and resources I had from my time in fundamentalism. And another one that I came across that I thought we should talk about is right here. Should Fundamentalists and Evangelicals Seek Closer Ties by Ernest Pickering, printed through Baptist World Mission. Based on that title, you might reasonably think the answer should be an obvious yes. Christians should work together instead of constantly infighting. But if you were raised fundamentalist like I was, you already know exactly where this is going, and it's the opposite direction. The answer, of course, to whether fundamentalists and evangelicals should work together is a resounding certainly not. And unfortunately, many people I know would still agree with Pickering here, that differences in beliefs among Christians themselves are enough to treat each other as apostate, adding yet another enemy to the ever-growing list of people that we just can't seem to get along with. Let's talk about why. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered, and I am rocking this amazing Peanuts hockey jersey that I got as a gift from my lovely wife Jana for Christmas, so just had to show that off. Guess I was doing a little Dan McClellan. The fit today is the Peanuts jersey. Should have saved that for the end. Anyway, back to the pamphlet. Let me set the stage for you here. Give you a little bit of history because I'm guessing you probably don't know who Ernest Pickering is. It's okay, I didn't really either. This pamphlet is a response to a book called In Search of Unity by Edward Dobson, not to be confused with the much worse James Dobson. Edward Dobson was a dean at Liberty University and a member of the Moral Majority. Pickering, the author of this pamphlet, was a graduate of Bob Jones and Dallas Theological Seminary. So we are talking about two very conservative people here. And honestly, this pamphlet kind of taught me something about fundamentalist history that hadn't fully clicked for me before. About a century ago, 1920s, 1930s, there was this massive fundamentalist modernist controversy, as is known, that really defined American Christianity for the next 100 years. I had been familiar with it, but the way Pickering talked about it in this pamphlet just made it make a little more sense than I think it ever had for me before. Because to the people who lived through that controversy, or who were trained by those who did, it was as significant as the Reformation itself. The question was whether to leave established churches that you personally believed were no longer teaching the truth. Many mainline denominations at that time were doing what Christianity has always done throughout its history, adapting to the times, updating views as evidence and understanding changed. But the fundamentalists added a moral element to this preference for tradition. It wasn't just the age-old argument between old ways and new ways. It was that the old ways were the only right way, and everything else was a perversion of the gospel. So these fundamentalists saw themselves as holy reformers who were forced to leave in order to maintain a pure church. Sounds noble enough, right? But here's what happened. By the time the next generation came around and people like me were raised in fundamentalism, the issues had completely shifted. Fundamentalism had become its own warped system that had gone way off track. It was no longer about the faith versus science questions of the 20s and 30s. It had become about personal standards of dress, music, entertainment, which Bible version you used, whether or not women should wear pants, whether you go to movie theaters, whether your music can have drums in it. But the old guard, the people who had been trained by that first wave of fundamentalists back from the 1920s and 30s, they acted like they were still standing for the same truth against error that their predecessors had fought for. They inherited the siege mentality and the separationist rhetoric without recognizing that the entire project had morphed into something barely recognizable. So let's look at Pickering's actual arguments, because they are full of contradictions, and even I was a little blown away by this pamphlet. He complains that he is being asked to remain in conversation with churches he believed have sacrificed the gospel because they admit they may have been wrong about some doctrinal claims before. Think about that. The crime here is intellectual humility, admitting that you may have been wrong. That is what disqualifies you from fellowship with this guy. He also claims that a true believer cannot remain in an apostate denomination, which I find to be a very odd claim from someone who came to emphasize the independent in Independent Fundamental Baptist. He paints an entire denomination with a broad brush, as if every church isn't unique, even within more hierarchical church structures. He complains about being asked to reconsider his separationist stances years later, as if people, churches, and denominations can't change over time. as if circumstances couldn't possibly warrant reconsideration. Apparently, once you have decided someone is apostate, that judgment is permanent, regardless of whatever happens after that. And here's where it gets really telling. Pickering lists what he calls the 5 fundamentals: full inspiration of the Bible, the deity of Christ, substitutionary atonement, the resurrection of Christ, and the second coming of Christ. He presents these as if they are all universally agreed upon, which technically they have not been, but that's all other matter for another time. It is the basis for a lot of evangelical and fundamental faith. I'll give him that. But then, and this is where the problem comes in, he says that even agreement on these 5 basic points is not enough of a basis for cooperation. Why not? Because people he considers heretics might also agree with those 5 points. Let that sink in for you. He has established these 5 fundamentals as core to the faith, but then says that they are insufficient for determining who is actually a real Christian. So what is sufficient? I guess agreeing with Pickering on everything else, too. And he claims that years ago, fundamentalists decided not to throw the baby out with the bathwater when dealing with modernism. But that's actually backwards. It was the modernists who remained Christian while removing some previous beliefs that they found untenable. It was the fundamentalists who made it an all-or-nothing decision, where you'd have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, where you either accepted their entire package or you were apostate. Dobson, in his book here, proposes taking a road back, he calls it, acknowledging that it was the fundamentalists who left the established system, and maybe that separation wasn't entirely warranted or helpful. But Pickering refuses because, and I promise you I am not making this up, that would require allowing someone like Billy Graham to not be all that bad. Let me read you the actual quote. "The seed that Billy Graham has sown has resulted in a frightful harvest of confusion and compromise." Billy Graham, the guy who preached the gospel to millions, who met with presidents and world leaders, who was widely respected even by non-Christians, that Billy Graham was too liberal, too compromising for Pickering. And the wild thing is, I actually heard that a lot growing up too. If Billy Graham is too liberal for you, there might be a problem. Oh, but we are not done. Pickering concludes by proudly declaring himself a separationist for over 30 years. But then he begs not to be seen as an extremist or a hate mongerer. Let me just say, if you have to preemptively defend yourself against accusations of extremism and hatred, you might want to check yourself. That's not the defense you think it is. And the most absurd contradiction of all is saved for the end. He says he is still willing to be friends with Dobson, but not with the people that Dobson is asking him to be friends with. So if I'm getting this straight, it is okay to compromise with the compromisers, just not with the people that they've compromised with. I don't get it. I don't know how that works. How many degrees of separation are we requiring here? Just one? What's really happening with all this is that fundamentalism built its entire identity on separation, on being against things, on drawing lines, on maintaining purity through isolation. And once you have built your identity on being separate, you can never stop finding new things to separate from. You can never stop narrowing the circle of what is acceptable. Because if you did, you would have to admit that maybe the original separation wasn't as necessary as you thought. You'd have to admit that maybe you're the one who left, not them. You'd have to grapple with the fact that your movement has morphed into something barely recognizable from its origins, that you're defending positions that have nothing to do with the gospel and everything to do with cultural preference and control. The tragedy is that this kind of thinking doesn't preserve the faith. It destroys Christian witness. It turns the gospel into an ever-narrowing set of litmus tests that no one can pass. It makes enemies out of siblings in Christ who just happen to disagree on secondary or even tertiary issues. If Billy Graham is too liberal for you, if intellectual humility is disqualifying for friendship, if admitting that you have been wrong about something makes you apostate, you don't have a movement defending truth. You have a movement defending itself. There's a profound difference.